Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And we are back with, I guess it's part 2 of our works of history that kind of changed our thinking or really inspired us in 2022. So a little less a bunch of recommendations because we know that we're already into 2023 basically, and you may not have time to go back to all this, but more like just a chance for us to talk about where we're at in terms of thinking about history and our works of history and being either jealous or inspired by other work. Last episode was a little more academic, and this episode is going to be a little more, popular work, both books, but also podcasts, Twitter threads, magazine articles, whatever. So here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there. And let me check. This is our last episode of the year. So happy New Year. Happy 2022. Thank you for another great year of working and thinking about history. But hey there.
Hello, Jody, and Happy New Year.
Hey there. Happy New Year.
So last time we kind of dug in on some work and then we talked and then we mentioned a bunch at the end. Let's start with the sort of speed round shout outs and then we can circle back and sort of talk about a few. But let me throw some out here. And this is a mix of a bunch of stuff. And then I have a couple that I want to kind of talk about a little bit more. But I guess this is old. I guess I'm breaking the rule already. This is old, but it was something that was new to me in 2022, and I shouted it on the show before. But that David McCullough book, The Johnstown Flood, we did an episode about it. I talked about why that book kind of blew me away. David McCullough died this year, but that was big for me in 2022, just as a work of really detailed, really compelling historical work. The Fiasco series with our friend Leon Nafuk about the AIDS crisis.
So good.
Really good, and I think took that show, which has been spectacular all along, kind of to another level in a way that we've talked a lot about this show about kind of like the power of historical empathy, and I felt like that was the most empathetic series they've ever done, with just incredible vivid details from people who lived through the AIDS crisis and saw their communities die and their leaders let them down, and it was just really spectacular. And then another podcast, we had this guy on the show, Nate Levy, but that show Foreign Agent, which was about the IRA's connection to the United States. I thought that was one of the best podcasts of the year, and another great work of, just a really great work of history, and then a great work of storytelling. And I guess the last one I'll shout out is Jamel Bowie, is basically writing really deep history in the New York Times. And I think I mentioned last episode how the This Day Twitter feed is mostly historians, and every once in a while I'll see a historian be like, can we just shout out Jamel Bowie for writing a column in the New York Times about this very, very obscure piece of history that I wrote my dissertation on 20 years ago and I thought no one would ever mention again. And here's Jamel kind of digging that up and crafting this work. And so talk about the power of bringing history, deep historical work to a popular audience, and talk about the difference between columnists who actually do research and do reporting and do deep thinking versus just sit there and sort of barf out 500 words a week. So anyway, that's my quick shout outs. I've got a few others, but anything else you want to quickly mention before we really dig in?
Jamel's column is very much the print version of This Day in Esoteric Political History. He goes deep in the esoterica. Well, you stole one of mine, Jody. I also thought that Foreign Agent was brilliant, and I'm really glad that we had Nate on. I will do another Bowie shout out and mention Unclear and Present Danger, which is his podcast with John Gans, which is kind of a low budget podcast about the political thrillers of the 1990s and exploring them through the lens of that post-Cold War era. I'm obviously obsessed with that era, but it's actually really fun to listen to these guys dig in. Often the discussion of the movie lasts 10 minutes, and then they fall down a rabbit hole to talk about Ruby Ridge or something else that is happening in the world that shapes the context for what they're talking about. So I love that.
And that guy, John Gans, by the way, writes a great newsletter and is just sort of a good thinker as well. So
yeah, John writes an amazing newsletter called Popular Front, which is a great segue because I also have a few newsletter recommendations. The first is not by a historian, but is about history that is being made on a regular basis, again, in the season of Dobbs. And that is Jessica Valenti's Abortion Every Day, which is a great newsletter for keeping up on the most recent horrors of women losing reproductive rights, and one that is by a historian at Northwestern University by Jerry Cadava called Latinos in Depth. He's a historian of Latino history, but particularly in this moment when there seems to be so much confusion about the Latino vote. Jerry does an amazing job of just getting into all of the different nuances and really assessing and examining not just what's happening currently with Latinos politically, but historically as well.
You guys are going to make me feel so superficial.
No, please. I have more.
I saved my superficial ones for...
Okay, so my picks are very poppy. And I'd say this all the time. I work on slavery. I work on violence. So my veg out food is really trashy TV. But I will say, one of the things I've been watching, and I have one episode left, is Kindred. So Octavia Butler, who is the Black sci-fi writer, wrote a book called Kindred decades ago, and it just exploded. It's a book that I read in 2 days. I flew through it. I didn't want it to end. It's the story of a woman who is time traveling. And so she is living her life in the 1970s and then gets pulled back into slavery. And she keeps getting, pulled back and forth in order to save her ancestor, who's ultimately responsible for her own life and existence. And it was such a powerful, it was the first time I had read Black sci-fi ever. And within the context of slavery, that I was just all in. And now it's on FX as an 8-part TV series.
Amazing.
And the first episode, I'm not going to lie, I couldn't go to sleep. I was like, I should not have watched this at night, because it's a little the idea of being... They modernize it, so it takes place in 2016. But the idea of being snatched into a time warp back into slavery and then having to navigate that space immediately is so jarring. And so I want to know how the series is going to end. I won't give any spoilers, but it's been something I've been enjoying lately as a nice, good binge TV.
Yeah.
It makes me think of Lovecraft Country in some ways, with that kind of time travel sci-fi.
Yes, the time travel, all of that. It's really, really good. There are also things that I think that are really problematic about it too, but we can talk about that later. And then there's a podcast I love that went off the air. I don't know how to say went off the air. It's in its finals. Had its series finales, which is for colored nerds, which I absolutely love, with Brittany Luce and Eric Gettings. They're so funny, but also so smart, so brilliant. And they did some really good episodes just about different Black lifestyles. They did a whole episode on fast fashion and how it impacts the Black community, which I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good. And not just the Black community, but how fast fashion impacts the global poor, that a lot of our excess clothes that we spend money on, get sent to Africa and to these really poor countries, and they have mountains upon mountains of old used clothes that they can do nothing with. And they did a really fascinating episode on Will Smith that I think went beyond the slap.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of, talk about Will Smith and the Oscars and all stuff. And I just got I was over it within 2 weeks. I was so over it. But this episode, they really look at his whole career, his latest film, Emancipation, which is on Apple TV, which is a slave film, and it's his first slave film ever. And I thought, wow, this is a really nuanced approach to understanding Will Smith, and I was here for it.
Yeah, that's funny to think of that show as a, teasing out the sort of history stuff in that show, but you're right. And I mean, so many of my favorite podcasts they add context, and where do you find context? Well, it's often by, crafting it and placing it in history. Yeah, I mean, I have a couple TV shows for sure that come to mind. Though I was, as I was thinking about this, it's funny. As much as we talk about the boom of pop history, this year maybe there was a little less than in the last couple years, and I wonder if that's just about production schedules or whatever. There were documentaries about GameStop or whatever, but there weren't that many of these deeper history things. But that show, I think people know I'm pals with Adam McKay, who was behind that show, Winning Time, which was about the Lakers. And really, is very interesting and I think controversial. And there's lots of things to be said about that as a work of history, and how much you allied history, and how much, you can do historically grounded work that then maybe gets you in hot water because you have to portray characters in certain ways. And so there was just sort of an interesting, the controversy around that and the portrayal of certain characters in some ways really hit at a lot of the things that you have to think about when you're doing the work of history for a general audience. So that got me thinking, but it was also just very fun to watch, and I kind of liked it. All in all, I did like it.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of like historical fiction shows still, like Yellowstone, which I have to confess I haven't watched.
I watched that.
We need an episode to talk about Yellowstone.
Yeah, I'll get into it.
The Crown is still on.
Yes.
I'm actually really waiting on Kelly to give me some movie recommendations. But before that, I will recommend a book that I absolutely loved, and that is the novel Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. Not a historian, not a history book, but it is a book that is set in like the 1950s and 60s with a woman who is a scientist at a time when women faced a lot of barriers to being scientists. And the mom in question, who is a scientist, is ultimately kind of forced to use her skills in a more acceptable field. So she starts a very popular cooking show in the 1960s. And so it is just this like lovely piece that obviously like deals with some complex and frustrating issues, but it is so well grounded in its time in this way that I loved every page of it and really loved it living in that world. It's been on the bestseller list. I'm not, mining this B-side of some forgotten album, but it is such an enjoyable book, and it really does scratch a history itch for me.
Yeah. Can I talk about films?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Just 2 days ago, I've been trying to see this film for a long time. My schedule has never allowed me. Finally, I got to see it with my husband. We went out with another couple. So many of you know, I've talked about on the show, my husband's a pilot, and he's actually building his own plane, an RV-7. He's like deep into aviation. So we went and saw Devotion, which is the story of Jesse Brown, who's the first Black aviator in the U.S. Navy. The film is really, really good. I shed a tear. I shed a lot of tears. It's just a powerful story about how Jesse Brown navigates his experiences, but mostly it's about the relationships that he builds while he's flying. And you see this really deep friendship between him and his co-pilot. And I loved every minute of it. It's not sort of like a biopic, but it definitely goes into like how we understand aspects of war that have often been forgotten. And the Korean War is a war that has definitely just been sort of forgotten about. But what it means to be a pilot during that time, and how Black pilots especially had to navigate that space. So it's really, really good. I loved it a lot. As my husband, I was like, I know you know all things aviation. Like, how did you feel? Because he asked me these same questions when I watch like historical films, and he appreciated it too. So it started off of a book. So if you want to read the book first, the book is always better, and that goes really into detail about Jesse Brown's life. I recommend the book first, and then go see the film. It's great.
Let's do. You want to get into films? Did either of you watch Who We Are? Do you know that? That was on, I think it was on Netflix. Do you know Jeffrey Robinson? I think he's like a historian or storyteller. Anyway, it's basically, or he's a lawyer, I think, as his background. But, he's kind of a storyteller, historian. But it's Who We Are, a chronicle of racism in America. And it's basically built around a lecture that he gives on stage. And then it's sort of supplemented with slides. I mean, he's showing sort of slides and photos and videos as he's giving the lecture. But it's, kind of both a mix of a personal history and a history of racism in America, of slavery, but a lot about redlining and about how cities got built. And I just found it very compelling. And it's just kind of like a history lecture turned into a very compelling thing. So it's on Netflix. I just stumbled across it, but I found it very compelling. Yeah.
So this has been a busy year. So much of my television and movie watching has been just, I enjoy much trashier television than Kelly does. Like watching Love is Blind and some really, I love it. So good. But I'm not gonna talk about that because that's a special place for me. But it does mean that I haven't seen like a ton of movies or new television shows. I did, while I was still in New York, go to see the play/musical Suffs. Do y'all remember this? This was a musical about the suffragists.
Oh, yes, I heard about that.
It's good.
Uh-oh.
Was that a pause or were you breaking up?
Look, it's reaching high. And it hits some really interesting points. It introduces you to a lot of like amazing, colorful characters, and it actually deals with the complicated fissures within the suffragist movement, along lines of race, along lines of class. It does get pretty didactic at times, a little preachy at times, and it did make me wonder in an interest, like when it comes to these popular culture things that we all enjoy. Is it better for it to be a little preachy and didactic, or is it better for it to be maybe a little problematic, but a little more natural?
I like problematic and natural.
Me too.
But, you know,
Save the preaching for church.
but it's still, but you still have to know what it's trying to say, right? And so I think that's the key, right? Ideally, right? I mean, it's like this gets to like my kind of basic thinking about work in general. It's like I think the best work walks you right up to then doing some thinking of your own and drawing some conclusions of your own. And I think that that's the most powerful thing is when, you know, you as a consumer of it or a listener or reader or whatever or watcher, you make the connections, you find the meaning, and you do the work, so to speak. But you kind of got to walk people pretty clearly right up to that point, and so it's a very fine line.
Yeah, it's very difficult to do, and I will say that the musical shits all over Woodrow Wilson, which I am 100% here for. Very enjoyable.
Love it. Love it.
Can I sneak in a shout out? I won't make this the big one I talk about, but I do have to give a shout out to the documentary All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, which is about a photographer, an activist, Nan Golden, but really is then also a history. It's a personal history of her and a look at particularly her activism, both in the AIDS epidemic, but then specifically around the opioid epidemic and her work fighting the Sackler family and the opioid industry. And it is fantastic. It won the Venice Golden Lion. It is likely to be nominated and maybe win the Academy Award. It was also produced by my sister, Shanti. So I'm very happy about that. She's the archival producer on that. But it is genuinely like, my sister has had a great year. I'm very proud of her. She's worked on some great stuff, including that. Awesome. And but it is really, you know, it's fantastic work. And we talked last episode, we've talked about it a little bit here, but, you know, that mix of family history and larger history and the personal and the political, and it just, you know, it very much just basically like hops back and forth between a personal story and a historical story, but it just in the way that I think a lot of our best work does, it sort of it weaves those two.
Can I tell something that I've watched that's a personal story, a political story, a family story? Harry and Meghan.
Oh yeah.
Me and my sisters were on a group chat, like
sure
going back and forth. One thing I will say that I appreciated is that they do have legit historians on who give you a larger context of British Empire and colonialism and like why this story matters in such a bigger framework than just one person. And the really violent history of racism and colonialism and empire that encompasses the royal family. And I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of scathing. Like, they're not holding anything back. I was engrossed in all 6 episodes. Yeah. Really was. It's great.
I have been holding off on watching it, so I was going to do some writing about it for CNN, and then I was like, do I want to dig into this? I don't know, because
yes,
so much.
you do. Watch it.
All right. It's on my holiday break list.
Watch it, and then we can talk.
All right.
Did either of you read Liner Notes for a Revolution that Daphne Brooks wrote?
Oh, yes. That was on my list of books. So, like I mentioned before, I'm on a bunch of prize committees. It won the book prize for the Museum of African American History, the Stone Book Award. It's a massive book. It's huge.
So I haven't read all of it. I've kind of done the like dipping in and out and looking for artists, but it's basically a look at Black female, mostly musicians, but cultural figures, but it's everything from like Bessie Smith to Ethel Waters and Beyonce and Janelle Monáe, and the sprawlingness of it is kind of part of what's really compelling about it, just the like audacity of weaving all these things together. But the parts that I found really kind of, I mean, I guess I sought them out, but then I also found them really compelling, were the parts where she talks about how a lot of Black women musicians have also had to be not just performers, but also curators of a legacy. And, there's specific examples in some of the artists I really modern artists I really love, like Valerie June and Rhiannon Gibbons. Like, they sort of are performers, but then they also, I mean, they're folk musicians in the in the largest sense of the word. And I would sort of qualify like Janelle Monáe or even Beyonce as like folk musicians in the sense of like, they feel this historical weight to carry on a tradition, not just they don't have the privilege, I guess, to just be performers. They also have to be curators and historians in their own right. And Daphne Brooks does some really interesting kind of writing and sort of just musing on that.
It's so good. It's definitely a thick book, I'm not gonna lie, but it's rich. I mean, you can't write that history in a couple hundred pages. So I mean, there's so much to it. I also recommend in tandem with that Still Processing, the New York Times
so good
podcast with Wesley Morris, who's also a friend of Operdemics, and Jenna Wortham did actually, I think it was just Wesley Morris was in conversation with Daphne Brooks about her book, and they did a whole episode on it. I'm not sure what season it's in, but it was quite profound. They also talked about just like the battle over like awards and Grammys and how people get counted on like
the charts. Their whole episode was hooked around kind of like who ends up on the charts and who doesn't and all that stuff.
Yes. And what does it mean to be counted? And should we even want to have this system of like points and measures and awards, because it's so political? It was probably one of the most nuanced conversations I've heard about what it means to like have a list and a chart and an award attached to it, and to question sort of the legitimacy or the motivations behind creating these lists.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think first of all, thinking about Still Processing, which is a podcast that I absolutely love. It goes on break every once in a while. And so I was just checking because I was like, oh, it didn't end, did it? No, it's still out there. So folks should go listen to it. It was very good. But I also think that there's been this really interesting conversation about Black country, which has been very wrapped up in like who gets to be on what chart. But it reminded me that Tressie McMillan Cotton did a really amazing look at Black country artists in Nashville.
I read that. That was so good. That was so good. Read that article. It was so good.
I think it was I want to say it's in Esquire. I'm going to look it up.
Right. Cool.
Yeah. It was an in-depth article about it was about covering several things, but what does it mean to be a Black woman country music singer, and how do you sort of like break into that world? But also like when you think about the themes and the tropes of country music, what people sing about aesthetically, what that world looks like, it's almost everything antithetical to Black womanhood. So it posed a lot of really good questions about like, how can you enjoy this music, participate in this music, and know that like the primary people who are listening to your music don't really want to see you there.
Interesting.
And how difficult it can be to be a Black person who loves country music and for whom some country music spaces are really unsafe, which is something that she talks a lot about as well.
Yeah.
This was a piece in Vanity Fair, and everyone should go check it out.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
we got some listener suggestions around this stuff too. So people shouted out podcasts like Cautionary Tales, which is Tim Harford's podcast. He's been on the show a couple times. We're friends there. A show called Patented, which looks at, is more of a sort of business history show. Looks at interesting ideas and products. A couple people in our crowd suggested this show, which I actually have listened to a few episodes of and really love, called The Stuff the British Stole, which is a look at museums and the British Museum. Really fantastic show. You're Dead to Me, which I don't know that show, but I just ended up on my list of shows people had shouted out. And of course, look, we got all the way in here, and I haven't mentioned any other Radiotopia shows, but there are, of course, so many great history-minded shows at Radiotopia. And so
I love The Stoop.
Yeah, The Stoop and Articles of Interest and Adultish and Memory Palace, of course. Like, so many of these shows do take on history in really inspiring ways. So, yes, support Radiotopia.
And we should say that The New Yorker just named Articles of Interest American Ivy as one of their top podcasts of the year. So you should definitely check that out.
Yeah, we'll have Avery on soon, but it's getting a lot of deserved love. Okay. Can I do like a little longer sort of shout out to something, and then maybe we can do that and we'll start to wrap up. But this is actually, maybe it's just recency bias, but I read this last week and was really kind of blown away by it as a work of history. But Derek Thompson, who writes for The Atlantic, is one of my kind of favorite writers for a long time, and he's just a very rangy thinker, and I think just kind of like both has ideas, but is more just interested in exploring ideas. And he, I think, has in the last year or so, I mean, he sort of said this explicitly, but in the last year or so, he's become a little obsessed with like progress and just sort of how does progress happen? Why does it feel like progress, especially in the United States, has sort of ended? Like, and the trite way is like, well, we don't make things anymore, but manufacturing and just sort of like the idea that the United States is at the forefront of new ideas. There's some stagnation that we all sense, and he's really trying to kind of puzzle that through from a bunch of different angles. And then he just wrote this big, long, I think it was a cover story in The Atlantic, piece that kind of feels like his magnum opus around this question, and also feels like him really advancing his thinking. And basically what he says is, that for a long time, the sort of story and the history of progress has been one about singular invention and either the big idea that breaks through or the sort of alpha inventor who comes up with a new idea, and what he has really kind of come to realize is that it's not as so much about the breakthrough idea or the genius inventor, but it's really all about implementation, and that an idea or an invention is only as good as how well and efficiently it can spread and be used. And so, he draws this distinction between like discovery and deployment. And he talks about how we've become so focused on discovery, and even just in the choices that we make in terms of what we fund or kind of how we talk. But really it's all about deployment of ideas. And sometimes that can happen fast. Sometimes that can take years and years and years. And it just sort of reframed. I mean, he talks about it as having reframed his thinking, and it's immediately reframed my thinking too. I mean, even like when there was that news of like that nuclear fission, right, that came out, and everyone was like, oh my God, we made this breakthrough. And I had just read his article, and so my first reaction was, well, okay, great, here's this breakthrough, but what is it going to look like to then actually implement this and put the resources behind it? And, I think people should go read the piece. I've talked about it enough, but basically, he really lands on kind of like, it's about government, like private sector can do the breakthroughs, but really ultimately government has a big role to play in terms of deployment. And then ultimately, the thing he really lands on, which to me is one of the big lessons of the last couple years, is, so much of this hinges on societal cohesion and trust, and how much do people believe in their government as a force for good? How much are they willing to, we saw this with the vaccines, we've seen this with so many things. And so we're in this era of stagnation, and a lot of that stagnation is related to the fact that we don't have cohesion and faith at a societal level that allows us to then sort of implement big ideas and lead to actual progress. Anyway, so great long piece, but not too long, so you could go and check it out, and it'll, it just kind of, I think will maybe change the way you look at stuff.
I love that. I absolutely love that. That's brilliant.
Well, I will tell you my deep dive thing, which isn't necessarily a recommendation, but it is an invitation inside my head and my AirPods, which is I have been listening kind of nonstop to this podcast called Knowledge Fight. And it is an analysis of Alex Jones's InfoWars. We recently talked about Alex Jones and his relationship to the Sandy Hook conspiracy theories and his $1.5 billion judgment that could very soon end InfoWars. But what I really appreciate about it are a few things. First of all, whenever they get a little sick of listening to Alex Jones talk, they will go back into the archives and they will pull out things like podcasts by other extremists. So they will go down the Nick Fuentes rabbit hole, or they will go back to some of the extremists from the 1980s and 1990s and look at how some of these conspiracies developed. They have several episodes on the protocols of the Elder of Zion to kind of break apart how these conspiracy theories are built and spread, and the things that look like logic that are actually just BS as a way of dismantling the kinds of claims and the kinds of tricks that entertainment conspiracy theorists like Jones use. But one of the things that I have particularly appreciated about it as somebody who writes about extremism is they spend a lot of time wrestling with the ethics of covering extremists like Alex Jones. Like, what does it mean to spend all of this time talking about him? Are you platforming him? Is there a responsible way to dissect these ideas and to grapple with somebody like Alex Jones, who sees bad publicity as publicity? So you might have remembered, this is from a couple of years ago, Alex Jones going on this big tear about eating his neighbor. Do you guys remember this? No. It is one of the funniest clips because it's so like over the top and weird, and it seems like somebody having both a mental breakdown but also saying the funniest shit on the planet because he's in this like crazy headspace. That goes viral. But for Jones, it's huge because he's like, everyone is paying attention. Then he puts out a false claim that he was actually doing kind of a Jonathan Swift thing, and that the media were misinterpreting him as a way of driving traffic to his site and driving traffic to his show. And so as they're discussing the cannibalism episode, they talk about, because when they first covered it, nobody was talking about it. And they were like, everyone is being so responsible. This is great. We can kind of break down how this fits into his techniques without actually having this become a big thing that goes viral. And then the next day it goes viral and everybody's watching it. And then the sense of disappointment that they have and the sense of struggle that they have, like with, are we putting these things out into the world and driving more traffic to Jones's show is just so interesting and such an important question for all of us to grapple with, especially as we move on to new social media that operate in different ways and reward a variety of things, because so much of the amplification of extremism is about our addiction to likes and clicks and retweets and dunking, and getting outside of that economy is really, really hard.
Getting outside of that economy is what leads me to my last and final book recommendation, which is a book by Tricia Hersey called Rest is Resistance. And it's a book, I just started listening to it. And the way things work for me is I either listen to a podcast and they recommend a book, and so then I go read the book, or I read a book and then it references a podcast or something like that. But in this case, this book is just like transformative for me, because I think so much of my work and a lot of our work where we just go from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing, and there's no break and there's no rest and there's barely a nap. And she talks about like having this long legacy of exhaustion in her family. And what I love about it is that it's not just like a self-help book. Like, she really ties it to capitalism and patriarchy and like how we think about work in and of itself. And I was just really blown away by that. I just bought this t-shirt that says, you know how they have all of these, she believed she could, so she did, all that kind of stuff. And so the t-shirt says like, she believed she could, but she needed a break, so she said no.
I could use that on a mug.
And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a manifesto. Like, And I don't know, something about going into 2023, I always think about, like, I think our first impetus is to, or sort of think, or impulse is to think about goals. Okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go work out. I'm going to run a marathon. I'm going to, you know, all of this, like, accumulate, attain. And she's like, no, stop, rest, take a nap, quit a job. You know, like, maybe it's not always that extreme, but like the ability to figure out when you're doing too much and then say, no, actually, I'm not going to take this meeting. And she says, I mean, it's a hard truth in that she says, like, I have made less money because of this. I have turned down opportunities because I have to say, I'm not the only person that can do this work or should be doing this work. And so, I don't know. For me, I think that's a really powerful example of what it means to, like, take control and cut back instead of adding on, and what that could mean if we all did that.
Yeah, wow, I love that, and it's so I mean, I've been thinking about a lot of that kind of stuff. Have I told you about the 4 hours thing? That I think I read that this year. Maybe it was at the end of last year, but definitely will carry it with me for into the next year and beyond. But I was reading some newsletter that was just about something else, but then at the end of it, the writer, who, you know, was kind of a freelancer and I think was writing to people who have a little bit of ability to create their own schedule or just kind of work on their own projects or whatever. But he basically said, like, we really have 4 hours of actual work in us in a given day. And you should recognize that and give yourself sort of permission to realize that after 4 hours, it is kind of diminishing returns. And, you know, I think we've all felt that, where you're just doing work for the sake of doing work and you feel that pressure and that guilt and, you know, but you're not actually advancing and doing the sort of more creative, big thinking stuff that no matter what our line of work is, like, we have to do that. And it was just like a sort of total reframing of my brain of just like, 4 hours. Like, that's really the amount that I can, and like the other hours of the day can be devoted to like busy work, right? And put that off to the side. But like real deep thinking, real creative work, real stuff that's going to kind of like push things forward, you probably only have about 4 hours of that. Maybe 2.
But this idea that the big ideas need a lot of space. And it can be really challenging to make that space. I'm so inspired by this book, Kelly, just from your description of it.
I know, it sounds great.
It's very good. Here's the
nap.
Yeah. She actually has nap retreats where people show up and they take naps. But yeah, I was like, wow, I want to show up to take a nap.
Yes.
It's really great.
It's actually one of my, I don't really make resolutions, but one of my actual tangible resolutions for next year is to nap.
I love it.
I love it too.
Related to the kind of like, you actually need to reset in order to get stuff done. But anyway, all right. Well, this has been really great. Again, we'll post this stuff in the newsletter. And if you want to shout stuff out, find us on social, find us on our website, thisdaypod.com. As we wrap up and we head out the door, a couple more listener things that have come in. Doug says he really likes these. I haven't read these, but he says he really likes these pop history blogs by a guy named Jimmy Marr, who writes the Digital Antiquarium and the Analog Antiquarium. Someone shouted out, actually two listeners shouted out this book, The Ruin of All Witches, Life and Death in the New World by Malcolm Gaskill, which is about the witch trials, but apparently is very sort of intimate and really focuses on one incident and paints a good picture. And so, I don't know, that feels like we'll find a reason to have him on and talk about that. And then we got a lot of... Rachel Maddow does not need our help. We got a lot of shout outs from people about her new series, Ultra, which came out this year, which I haven't listened to, but I think I'm sure I've heard very good things about it, and I'll get to it at some point. And it's already been optioned for a big movie with
of course.
Steven Spielberg or something. Anyway, they don't need our help. But anyway, I want to acknowledge the many shout outs we got about that. So yeah, okay. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode, and hopefully we gave you some stuff to maybe check out, but also really, I think this was a nice kind of way to just sort of frame where we're at in terms of how we think about history and stuff that's inspiring us and so forth, and we will, of course, bring that into all the episodes we do in the new year. So, Happy New Year to you, listeners, and Happy New Year to you, Nicole Hemmer. Thanks for doing this.
Happy New Year, Jody.
And Happy New Year, Kelly Carter Jackson.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Radiotopia.
From